Welcome to this installment of Tracking the Cross. This one will be on the Black Motorist Guide, the Green Book. In this episode, you will be listening and learning about the creator of the Green Book and a Waycross superstar. The Green Book was considered one of the nation's earliest highway safety devices. So why haven't the majority of U.S. citizens heard of it? And what is the significance of this little green guidebook hold for American citizens? Here is our co-host Connor Griffin letting you know who these people are. And thank you for listening to Tracking the Cross and learning more about Southeast Georgia history.
During the early 20th century, the southern United States was considered as highly dangerous territory for a black citizen. It was the era of Jim Crow. Following the passage of the 13th Amendment, which spelled the demise of slavery's legality in the United States, state and local laws pushed back on this decision and found loopholes in the form of what were known as the Black Codes. In Georgia, our state's General Assembly passed them immediately following emancipation, which made legal the inhumane mistreatment of black workers at a cheap cost. And this pushback was not limited to Georgia. Many like-minded southern states were to do the same. This vicious regime led many black southerners to look to the north in hopes of finding freedom and opportunity. This wave of approximately 6 million black people seeking a new life became known as the Great Migration. Oftentimes, educational and economic prosperity was thought to be found in such cultural hubs as, in fact, the Big Apple is where our story begins. This was where, on November 9th, 1892, Victor Hugo Green, author of the Green Book, came into the world. In 1913, Green begins work as a postal carrier for the United States Postal Service in Bergen County, New Jersey. 5 years later, in 1918, Green marries Alma Duke of Richmond, Virginia. Shortly after marrying, the two moved to Harlem, in New York, the rapidly progressing mecca of black culture. With them, Green's work follows, as do his ideas. Because of segregation, many southern states required black travelers to use separate facilities thanks to those states' laws. The hostility extended into the north, too. Throughout the 30s, Green would travel throughout New York, gathering data on those businesses, hotels, restaurants, service stations, and, as in the case of Waycross, Georgia, local residents who would offer up their homes to take care and see to the safety of these travelers. In 1936, Green compiled his data together and published the first iteration of the Black Motorist Green Book. These editions were a publication series for the intended purpose of helping African American road trippers travel across America safely, with the first edition mainly focusing on the New York area. In 1947, he established a vacation reservation service, a travel agency to book reservations at black-owned establishments. By 1949, the guide included international destinations in Bermuda and Mexico. It listed places for food, lodging, and gas stations. In 1952, Green changed the name to the Black Traveler's Green Book. His travel agency office was located at 200 West 135th Street in Harlem, New York. Green died on October 16, 1960 in Manhattan, New York City, at age 67. After his death, publication continued with his widow Alma serving editor until 1966. The publication of the Green Book was intended to continue up until it was no longer necessary. Although this was not true, the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 proved to be a turning point. Because of this, the year was 1967 when the Green Book ceased publication. Now, we'll turn our focus to another hero of the same story. In the fall of 1964, 4 months after the Civil Rights Act was passed, Samuel Adams from Waycross, as a writer of the now discontinued periodical, the St. Petersburg Times, decides to travel with his wife, Elenora, following the Green Book. Highway to Hope became his 7-series writing piece, discussing the 4,300-mile, 15-day-long journey. Throughout these travels, they passed through 12 different states: Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. 38-year-old Sam Adams had 3 degrees at the time: a bachelor's in English and Fine Arts from West Virginia State College, a bachelor's in journalism from Wayne State University, and a master's in journalism from the University of Minnesota. This journey would be no easy task for 2 people of color. After all, they would be driving into states where people of color had been blamed for crimes they did not commit, bullied, arrested, or at worst, lynched or killed in some other manner. Even so, they chose to make the trek peacefully and without weapons, although many of their friends offered to have weapons brought with them. Samuel wrote, "I have lived with fear so long, I am hardly aware it's there." The quote you just heard, along with all future material in this podcast episode, is referencing the culmination of Samuel and Eleanora's journey, the piece he wrote that would come to be known as Highways to Hope. Samuel's assignment was to unbiasedly go forth into these states and observe the reaction of the Civil Rights Act being passed. What this entails is that businesses were to no longer refuse service on the basis of race or the color of a person's skin. Unsurprisingly, he found loopholes that Southern restaurant owners would use to their advantage, such as limited seating, raised prices, or closing their doors whenever they saw the couple approaching, despite this going against their regularly posted business hours. If seating was ever found, it was often in a location conveniently hidden from white customers. Similar tactics were used by hotel owners throughout the South. One especially frustrating case happened in Mobile, Alabama, where, after being turned away on the notion that the hotel only accepts large families, they were finally able to book a room over the phone. Upon arrival, they found that their booked room was a unit next to a squeaky elevator shaft and a rackety heating system. Where there was blatant hatred and hostility, however, gracious kindness and hospitality were also discovered. At a honky-tonk in Danville, Virginia, a white man politely asked if he could set his beer on the couple's table while he played a game of shuffleboard. The city of New Orleans for them was described as an oasis. Samuel's account of visiting the city was as follows. "We lived fabulously in that wonderful city and raised some eyebrows in the process. What is just a social treat for the typical white tourist to New Orleans was a fabulous wonderland for us. The rest of Louisiana, however, was one disappointment after another. after being turned down at a Holiday Inn even after reserving due to the staff not knowing they were colored when they took the reservation. The couple exhaustedly rode around for hours the next morning, constantly being rejected service. The lack of respect and basic necessities the Adams faced daily left a toll on their worn souls. Elenora became depressed, and I developed a splitting headache for want of food, Samuel would write. Despite their fears, the Adams returned to St. Petersburg, Florida, safe and sound. Samuel would write, "We completed the trip without violence or major incident, a feat which would not have been possible 6 months ago." Here is an excerpt from Highways of Hope, Part 1, Florida and Georgia, written by Samuel Adams. This was published November 8, 1964, and it talks about his time spent in Waycross, Georgia during his trip. When we walked into the Ware Hotel in my native Waycross, Georgia, the head bellman recognized me instantly. He had known me and my family since I was a child. Others also knew me, and I was given a room without question. I suspect that I was the first black guest ever registered at the Ware. Whites watched curiously, black employees with quiet pride and jubilance as we were shown to our room. Samuel's reports were generally well received, some even praising his unbiased temperament towards an assignment that Newsweek magazine called the most dangerous assignment in U.S. journalism. Especially striking to me was a reaction written in to the St. Petersburg Times by local Saul J. Cutler. Quote, "Sam Adams has shown to the open-minded public what it means to be a black individual in the United States. He has done this without any rancor or hate, but just described what happened, as though he were a critic at a motion picture theater." Despite the danger and the risk, Samuel and Elenora were overall happy that they experienced what they did, and even had the notion of the possibility of another similar trip in the future when the bigotry had died down. Samuel eloquently writes about the current state of race relations during his time. Quote, "Racial prejudice isn't going to evaporate because Congress passed a law. It will be many, many years before a black individual driving through the South can forget his fear. But the black individual has hope now." Much of Samuel and Eleanora's journey we found through an article in the Tampa Bay Times written by Gabrielle Calise. Without her knowledge, this podcast episode would have significantly less ties to Waycross. Both the Adams eventually retired to Waycross, Georgia. Samuel passed here in April 2019, with Elenora dying a year later in April 2020. Samuel's obituary in the Waycross Journal-Herald, posted April 25, 2019, details many of Samuel Adams' accomplishments and paints a fascinating portrait of his life, rubbing elbows with some of the biggest names in history and contributing plenty of pieces of his own. Here is an excerpt from the Journal-Herald obit. During his 42-year career, he served as an award-winning journalist, an educator at 5 universities, a national political consultant, a civil rights activist, and started the first black radio newscast on the nation's first black-owned station, Atlanta's Word 860. He was a friend of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. The two debated the role of the black press and the ministry in the civil rights movement. The list of people he interacted with included Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, civil rights activist Vernon Jordan, civil rights activist Medgar Evers, actor and activist Ossie Davis, comedian and activist Dick Gregory, and 1972 presidential candidate Hubert H. Humphrey, just to name a few. He had a knack for being where the action was. In 1963, he was the only black reporter from the major media covering the integration of the University of Alabama, standing only 10 feet from Governor George Wallace, who defiantly blocked the doorway to a classroom in Tuscaloosa. He was there to cover the violence in Birmingham when peaceful demonstrators were thrashed with fire hoses. He was there in Washington, D.C. when King delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. He was at the Watergate building during the 1972 break-in, serving as the Deputy Director of the Minorities Division and the Assistant Director of Communications for the Democratic National Committee. He worked as a reporter for the Atlanta Daily World, a copy editor for the Des Moines Register, and an investigative reporter for the St. Petersburg Times. He was an educator at the University of South Florida, the University of Wisconsin, the University of Kansas, Hampton Institute, and the University of the Virgin Islands. He mentored many black students who had successful careers. 3 of them would win Pulitzer Prizes, one of his proudest achievements. University of Kansas, he founded the Ida B. Wells Award, given annually by the National Association of Black Journalists, to honor people who have shown exemplary achievement advancing, hiring, and promoting minorities in the news media. Ironically, the National Association of Black Journalists awarded Samuel this award in 2002 after his retirement, and earlier awarded him a Lifetime Achievement Award in 1997.
Thank you for listening to this installment of Tracking the Cross, where we explore the history of Southeast Georgia and Waycross. This is brought to you by the creators Harlan Valentine and Ingram Connor Griffin, along with Waycross Convention and Visitors Bureau. See you in the next episode. Bye!